Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 264, I chat with Joel Barsotti, Derek Smith, and Stacey Spears, all from SpectraCal, about high dynamic range. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded July 16th, 2015. Episode 264, SpectraCal on HDR. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and editor of avsforum.com. This week, I have three guest geeks, all from the same place, all from SpectraCal, the company that has given us CalMan and the ability to calibrate our displays, and they advocate for that greatly. And today we're going to be talking about high dynamic range. First up is Joel Barsotti. He's the director of software development. Hey, Joel, welcome to the show.
Hi, Scott.
Good to see you. Next to him, we have Derek Smith, the CTO and co-founder of SpectraCal. Derek, welcome back.
Thanks, Scott. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you so much. And finally, we have Stacey Spears, chief color scientist for SpectraCal, and he's been on the show a number of times. Stacey, glad to have you back.
I'm glad to be back, Scott.
So for those of you who are tuned in to the live stream at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room there or at irc.twit.tv, you can post questions for any of these fine gentlemen, and I will pass along as many as I can. I'll be monitoring the chat room, and it helps if you put my screen name in your post, in your comment. My screen name is my name, Scott Wilkinson, no spaces or dashes. That way it shows up in a different color on my screen, and I can see it more easily. It draws my eye there. So just a word to the wise. Okay, so as I said, we're gonna talk about high dynamic range today. And so these guys are three of the most, the smartest color scientists and video scientists I know. So I think we're gonna get some really interesting information today. Let's start with sort of a brief intro to high dynamic range, what it is, how it differs from current display technology, that sort of thing. Who'd like to start?
Want to take it, Joel? Oh, sure. Well, HDR is a new concept in presenting content for display and consumption, and the traditional displays have always been sort of limited by the display technology, in that old tubes could only produce so much light output, and so we were limited to roughly about 100 nits of light that we're able to produce. And so this is a real artificial image compared to what we see every day. When you go outside, the sidewalk on a sunny day could be 5,000 nits, or 50 times brighter than what your old tube TV could do. And so as technology has progressed and we've gotten new and innovative backlighting technologies, we've been able to make brighter and brighter screens. The old the Sharp Elite from a couple of years ago, it could do 1,000 nits. And so the idea that we can produce extremely bright backlights is not a new thing, but we've never really had the content to use it because we've been continually mastering at that 100 nit level in a dark room, which with a really good contrast ratio in that dark room can provide a really nice image. But it's nothing compared to what we can do with HDR. When we start going from 100 nits to 1,000 nits to 4,000 nits and beyond, it really opens up the ability to do things with not just bright white lights, but colors. And because one of the things that is not well understood about color is that the brighter the color, the more saturated and vibrant it appears. And so even with a standard Rec 709 color gamut, when you start pumping the colors way up in brightness, you get really vivid saturated colors that you wouldn't have thought were capable of in that kind of color space. And so HDR is going to bring bright, vibrant colors specular highlights that, really pop, and, detail in bright areas that was, previously something that we weren't able to capture and reproduce, or actually reproduce. The capture part of it's been there for a long time.
Right. And in fact, what you just said earlier was something I want to make sure everybody understands, which is that we've had TVs, displays, that can produce more than 100 nits, which is a measurement of how bright something can get. But we haven't had the content that could be delivered to those TVs. Virtually all content up to now has been mastered or graded to have a peak luminance, a peak brightness of 100 nits. And so if the TV could do 1,000 nits like the old Sharp Elite could, you wouldn't use all of it. Or if you did, you would be distorting or stretching what the content creator actually created in the mastering suite, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so we've had display technology that's been doing that, but calibrating to the mastering standards, we've been essentially throwing away a lot of capability that even some of the older displays were capable of.
Yep.
And even if you use the high brightness of the existing displays, you're just stretching the dynamic range. You're not really increasing the dynamic range. It's just sort of being stretched out linearly.
Yeah.
Right.
So it doesn't really look any better.
So the key is to not only have displays that can do it, but content that has that information encoded within it. And there are a couple of things to think about along those lines. One is, as you increase the dynamic range, the difference between black and white, you probably need more bits to encode each brightness level, because as you go wider and wider and wider, the difference between one step and the very next step becomes visible on the screen in terms of banding and so on. So we need 10 bits, 12 bits. Joe Kane advocates for 16-bit floating point even. And we also need a different, what's called an EOTF, electro-optical transfer function, which is how the display responds to the brightness signal in the signal coming in, of how much light is it going to output. One of you, any of you, I'm sure, can talk very intelligently about the difference in bit depth, resolution, and the electro-optical transfer function, and why we need to get away from what we're currently using.
Sounds like a Joel.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that sounds like it's probably up my alley. Yeah, and so your analogy there of how the bits work when we're going to larger and larger dynamic ranges is relatively accurate. I kind of like to think of it as like a staircase, right? And so if you build a staircase that's 100 feet and it's got 255 steps on it, that sounds good. But then you take that same 255 steps and you try and make it go to 1,000 feet or 10,000 feet. Well, now you can't even climb the staircase anymore. So,
well, that's a great analogy. I had never heard that one before. That's excellent. I'll remember that.
And so, obviously we're going to need more bits. But the other thing with there is that, in the staircase analogy, we're working in kind of a linear space. Well, our eyes are heavily influenced by our brain. And so the way we perceive light is, sort of logarithmic, sort of gamma-y. It's, it depends on where you are in the range, exactly how we perceive the contrast differences. And so there's a model called the Barton model that was, well researched, that all of the PQ standards are based off of. And so what they're seeking to do with the PQ method for implementing an EOTF is, and the PQ stands for perceptual quantizer. And so what they're trying to do is, quantize the luminance ramp in a step that's just below our ability to perceive a difference. And so that's why this is going forward going to be the preferred method for digitizing video, is that what we're looking to do is create steps that are just below our ability to see a difference. Because when you pull up like a grayscale ramp with any 8-bit source, it doesn't matter how good the display is, you're going to be able to see each one of those steps. Maybe one or two start blending together, especially closer to the top end, because when you look at the way bits get used in an 8-bit world, we don't really have enough down at the bottom, and and it's not until the very sort of top end of the signal that we start having enough bits that each step starts to blend together. And so our goal here is to get, a standard that has enough bit depth and has the right kind of transfer function, so we're using the bits efficiently so that we can get, those steps down to the point where we will see a, truly smooth ramp when we look at, a stepped grayscale pattern.
Right. And we have a couple diagrams to show people here. They're called 10-bit and 12-bit. So if we can take a look at those, you can explain what we're looking at here to show
sure.
the differences. Here we go.
And so these were from a SMPTE presentation several years ago. And so on this one, we can kind of see the purple curve is the Barton ramp threshold. And so that's sort of the contrast ratio where we're able to perceive a difference between, the previous step and the next step. And so we can see here that, when you take, a 10-bit Rec 1886, BT 1886 gamma, and you try and stretch it out to 1,000 nits from 100 nits, that it starts to really fall apart, and that for the most part, almost the entire signal, you can, differentiate the bit steps. And this is with 10-bit, not 8-bit. And so you can quickly realize why they thought the existing standard was not going to work for them. And so, and then what they show here on the green line is, the 10-bit 10,000 nits, and the black one is 10-bit 1,000 nits. And you can see that there wasn't a huge difference between those two, that the 10-bit still really isn't enough, but it's significantly better, and it's below that Schreiber threshold, which, is kind of the, you can maybe see it, but it's, not going to be as bad. Granted, what we really want to do is be on the other side of the Barton threshold, which is why, people like Dolby want 12 bits. And so if we could see the 12-bit one.
That'll come up here in a sec, I'm sure.
Yeah. So when we go to 12 bits, you can see that all of a sudden now we have plenty of bits to get onto the other side of the Barton ramp. And so, a 12-bit PQ encoded image can easily express 10,000 nits and as well as a 1,000-nit image. And so while the 1,000-nit, so going through their thought process when they came, are we going to have HDR for 1,000 nits, or are we going to have HDR for 10,000 nits? How much dynamic range should we encode? You could see that neither of them were really quite there at 10-bit, but at 12-bit, they're both good enough. And so there wasn't a good reason to try and come up with a solution that was a 1,000-nit solution, that going to a 10,000-nit solution would give us plenty of headroom, and that either way, what we really want is 12 bits. And here you can see, even with 12 bits stretched to BT 1886, it's still really not sufficient. And, once you get over about, 10 candelas, then we do start to see, or 10 nits, then it does start to be enough. But at the low end, still, BT 1886 is not good enough to give us the resolution we need to keep the stair steps small enough so that we don't perceive the difference.
So in other words, just let me reiterate here, with a BT 1886 gamma, which is more or less the gamma we use today, under 10 nits with a very dark image, if you go from, value X to value X plus 1, just the next step up, you're going to see that as a stair step, sort of. Whereas above 10 nits, you probably won't see any stair steps. It'll look smooth.
Yeah, and that's with a 12-bit signal. And so that's with a lot of bits. And that's, we're talking in a controlled environment, optimized to be able to see the smallest differences you can see. And so, in a practical environment with, ambient light and things, that might not necessarily be the case, but, that was the research that went into that diagram.
Right.
And
Stacey, you were about to say something?
Yeah, so if you wanted BT 1886, I think you would need approximately 15 bits of resolution to equal 12 bits PQ.
Right. PQ, well, this brightness thing we were talking about, I want to mention that because we mentioned that everything today, almost everything, is mastered for the home to 100 nits peak brightness. The Sharp Elite could do 1,000. The new Samsung SUHD TVs can do almost 1,000, I've heard. But so what is this 10,000 nits? There's no display that can do 10,000 nits unless you're talking about looking straight into a digital cinema projector, which I don't recommend.
Well, I think they're just planning for the future. And something that's worth pointing out is just because we're going to 1,000 nits, 4,000 nits, 10,000 nits, the average picture level of your movies aren't going to change. They're still going to be lower. You're still going to have the same average picture level. It's just you're going to use the higher brightness scenes for specular highlights, for the sunset, situations like that. So your movie's just not going to be 10 times brighter or 100 times brighter.
Right. Well, this is something that I hear a lot. A lot of people complain, or worry, I should say, that, oh man, if we go to 1,000 nits or 4,000 nits, which is, I think, the top of current flat panel technology, and it's a custom job from Dolby, you know, that we're going to need to wear sunglasses or we're going to burn out our retinas. And what you just said really says that's not true, right?
Right.
There may be some original, you know, some original mastering material where they kind of overbake it like they did with 3D, where it's kind of cartoonish. But you know, for the effect, you know, they may light it up more than you really need to. But the intent, you know, it just gives the producers, directors more creative capability to tell their story more effectively.
And also, it's worth pointing out today with 100 nits, I've been told by a couple colorists that they don't even go to 100 nits. They stay below 100 nits because they're trying to be conservative. So,
yeah.
So we're probably not going to see. Go ahead.
Well, and you know, one of the demo clips that I've seen for demoing HDR starts with a pilot walking around inside a hangar that's nice and dark and dim, and on both displays, you know, the content looked, you know, effectively the same, and you know, with a standard, you know, reference grade monitor on one side and then an HDR enabled display on the other. And you know, it wasn't until the pilot reaches the hangar doors and then you get the sun shining in from outside, and on the standard definition display we get our kind of, you know, iPhone HDR kind of tone mapped. Well, it looks super bright outside, but it really just looks like a big white blob through the hangar door, which sort of tells us that it's supposed to be super bright outside. And then on the HDR display, it actually is really bright outside, but it's blue sky and, you know, grassy hills and, you know, asphalt going out to the runway. And you can see all of that detail. And I think that's really the thing that HDR is going to enable is additional detail that just got lost in the tone mapping previously, because we've got all of these extra steps that we can play with to show that detail. And so that's the part about it that's really exciting for me. And so, you know, the average two faces talking to each other in a normal room looks the same, but it's all of these highlights and extra detail that you get in that more closely resembles what you're going to see in the real world.
And there's another demo clip where there's a welder in the dark and he's got yellow gloves on. And in the SDR version, the gloves go white, but in the HDR version, the gloves maintain the yellow color. So it's not really brighter, but you can see that you can make out the color detail.
And we're going to talk more about that particular aspect of things, color detail and greater range of colors in high dynamic range in just a second. But first, I got a couple questions from the chat room for you. One is from Berniak, who says, I understand HDR works with HDMI 2.0A, but what version is necessary for those of us with DisplayPort? The most common version being 1.2, such as high-end graphics cards. Do we have HDR in the world of computer graphics yet? Do any of you know?
There is no established standard right now for HDR in Windows or on the Mac. So right now it basically exists solely as an HDMI spec for transmission. You know, in the mastering world, they're able to do it by basically forcing displays into PQ mode and then, you know, feeding it a known signal that's already been cooked for HDR, as opposed to, you know, having additional metadata that describes it. So, you know, for now, you know, there's very limited, you know, HDR sources. You know, right now it's basically all only streaming or over, you know, over the box streaming kind of stuff. So until we really see, you know, dedicated Blu-ray players and things like that, and then, you know, it is something where Dolby Vision does have some modes that enable it to basically be sent over, any YCC signal, because they sort of watermark their content with the metadata. So it may be possible to use DisplayPort for that, but the display maybe won't even recognize it on that port because they assume that there's no standard there. So until rubber meets the road, we might not really know on that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Well, Rusty Bones asked, will HDR require greater power consumption? And if so, will it still have to achieve the power consumption guidelines, say, in California? I happen to know something about this, which is that the Samsung display can get to 1,000 nits, but not in a full white field. If you were to put up a full screen white field, it could not reach 1,000 nits without, it would have to draw so much power that it would just be ridiculous.
That's probably the consumer Samsung. The ones the studios have been modified with special power supply, so they can do full screen 1,000 nits.
Ah,
but
okay.
The consumer models will probably do 500 nits.
So what we're going to see, Scott, is the physics. Is there are displays, like the Dolby Pulsar. It can hit 4,000, but it also takes about 50 amps of power to do that. So the technology is here to produce displays that can go that bright. But as they start building consumer displays, again, they have to adhere to power standards. And so, they're going to get as creative as they can to get backlights as bright as they can, but they still have to adhere to power standards to be able to do that.
Well, at Cynic here, they showed a 32-inch display. I think that was 2,000 nits at 134 watts.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and also the Pulsar, this Dolby monitor, which is a custom-built monitor, is liquid cooled. Am I not? Is that not right?
Yeah, they drive the LEDs really hard.
And in fact, that leads me to I Am Special's question, which is, won't higher luminance burn out LEDs quicker?
Well, that's another concern for the manufacturers is, lifespan of the display and warranties. And so, they can produce displays now that can put out a lot of light, but they'll either burn out or consume too much power. And so they have to balance warranty, lifespan, power consumption. And the way a lot of it's going to happen is we've got local dimming systems that we've been using local dimming to get our displays darker. Well, that local dimming is going to come into play that we can also use that to do zoning for very specific brightness areas for zoning. And so they can, like we're saying, we can only do a small zone at a very, very high bright level. That gets us around the overall power requirements, and it's only going to be for a short period of time, so you're not pushing it that hard all the time, and so it gives it time for the LEDs to cool back down.
This leads me to it. Sorry, go ahead.
It's certainly something that needs to be designed around, but they make LED projectors that have far longer lifespan than any bulb-based projector. So I think that it's a problem that they know how to solve, and it'll just be up to the manufacturers to make sets that have good longevity.
Although I think it's a bigger issue for OLED than it is for LCD.
It's a far bigger issue for OLED than LCD.
Yes, exactly. You're mentioning local dimming, and it reminds me of high dynamic range projectors, which we're now starting to see, Dolby Vision projectors, which, as far as I can read the patent applications, uses a form of local dimming or zonal variation in brightness. And as we all know, local dimming on LCD TVs with full array backlights, the zones that can be dimmed or brightened independently are much larger than pixels. And so we sometimes get this haloing effect. And so I'm concerned that we're going to see that if these zones get a lot brighter, which we're talking about, say a star, a bright star in the sky, or a flying saucer or whatever, something really bright against a really black space background, something like that, you're going to start seeing much more haloing. That's going to be a problem, don't you think?
That is going to be a problem. I know the manufacturers are working on ways of dealing with it. And the inverse of that was when they were dealing with local dimming for the black levels. The same thing would happen is they'd go to absolute black. They needed to light an area up. You get haloing around it. I know they've come up with fairly advanced algorithms and dithering how they get around those areas, but it's going to be the same problem when they go to specular highlights within a dimming area where they've brightened it up.
Mm-hmm. I have one graphic here I'd like to show and have you guys talk about a little bit, which basically compares the dynamic range of the human visual system overall with how much it is instantaneously and then how much we actually have in our current system. The graphic is called dynamic range. And I just wanted to make sure I showed this. The human overall dynamic range is like 14 orders of magnitude. We're only sensitive to about 5 orders of magnitude at any given instant, and that shifts up and down depending on the amount of overall ambient light. But as you can see here, the display tech of today is only 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. So are we going to get to 5 orders of magnitude with these new displays?
Well, and that's, I think, where the research kind of ended up was, how bright is bright enough, and where do we start exceeding what the average human system is capable of. And once we get to 10,000 nits in a darker room, we've started approaching some of those limits.
Yeah. Well, and again, we don't have 10,000 nits yet, except in a very specialized rig that Dolby put together with a digital cinema projector. But as you say, Stacey, they're preparing for the future. They're leaving headroom that we may eventually get there someday.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Here's a question that you guys talked about. Stacey, you and Joel did a video for SpectraCal that's up on YouTube, and it's a very interesting video. And you talk about, one of you, I forget which, talked about the difference between photographic high dynamic range and video high dynamic range. We have photographic high dynamic range. You can take, say, multiple exposures of a given scene and put them together and get high dynamic range. But what's the difference between photographic and video high dynamic range?
Well, in the photographic high dynamic range, you're dealing with pretty low dynamic range sensors. So they're using the HDR mode on that to basically try to capture some highlights with some low lights. But they're also using, well, in some cases, I think one of the sample pictures we showed in that video, they actually use 2 cameras. So they use 2 cameras in a 3D mirror rig, but perfectly aligned, so you captured one image. And but then they did a terrible job blending them together using tone mapping so that everything sort of had this artificial glow around it. But
yeah,
the HDR in photography has mainly been used to work around the low dynamic range limitation of digital camera sensors.
But video camera sensors or digital cinematography camera sensors have got a pretty wide dynamic range now, don't they?
Oh, yeah, they're much better than what you get like on your cell phone camera, for example. So I think, first of all, there's no universally agreed upon standard to measure a camera's dynamic range. Every manufacturer publishes the number of stops they can capture, and that's in a sort of lab environment. And so sometimes when you measure that yourself, one, you don't know how they measured it, and then when you measure it yourself, you don't get the same results. So I think some manufacturers claim 12 stops, 14 stops, 16 stops of dynamic range. And we have a chart from DSC Labs called the Xyla 21. It's got 21 steps on it, which allows you to measure up to 20 stops of dynamic range. And I think when measuring, for example, the Red Dragon, we're easily able to measure 14 stops. And then if you did some frame averaging to remove some noise or some noise reduction, you could get up to 16 stops. Or an Area Alexa, I think, is also around 14 stops. Those are some of the 2 leading high dynamic range cameras. But for some of the Dolby content, they actually took 2 Area Alexas in a 3D mirror rig, so they could potentially capture up to 28 stops of dynamic range.
Wow. So they're doing like what some people do with photography, is capturing the high end and the low end simultaneously, and then they're going to somehow blend them together.
Yeah, then you usually have to do a manual process of blending them together.
I think the Sony F65 anyway, or maybe the F55 as well, is claiming 14, 15 stops as well. But I find it fascinating that you say, that you don't know how they measured it. They might have measured it some weird way in a lab that would not translate into the real world situation, which is so common. I mean, it really very frustrating. How do they measure amplifier power, for example, or
how do you measure contrast ratio on a projector or a display?
Or a display, exactly. And many people are claiming millions to one and so on and so forth, and it really is not reasonable.
Well, and there's a cinematography mailing list, And Jeff Boyle does a camera shootout every year. So he's an independent third party. And he has his own method of measuring cameras. And he publishes all the results along with all the source files. So you can look at it yourself. One of the problems with dynamic range is once you start to get into the darker part of the image, it's how much noise is acceptable to you.
Right.
Because I might accept more noise or less noise than Joel might accept, for example.
I don't like noisy pictures.
Neither do I. I want nice, clean pictures. Although that does bring up the question of some people, some filmophiles, you know, really like film grain. I myself am happy to see it gone, but there are those who like it, and it's essentially a type of noise, but an attractive one to some, huh?
It is, and some of the digital sensors have gotten better, so their noise, when you start to get into the dark parts of the image, are more organic, if you could use that word, I guess.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Versus splotchy.
Berniak is asking, sorry, Drew Nielsen first. Will game consoles ever support HDR in games? Do you guys have any clue about that?
Well, games already render in 32-bit floating point or 16-bit floating point internally, so they're capable of HDR. They just have to actually output HDR. But Joel might have them.
Right, and so, you know, I don't have, you know, I only have the relationships that we've had with, the video side of HDR, and so I don't know that, you know, which, if any, of the consoles are working towards it. But I have heard from the big video vendors that are working on it that it is likely a technology that's going to happen, and for video games it'll probably happen in the consoles first because they do have that HDMI infrastructure going to displays as opposed to PC monitors. So the first HDR gaming is likely going to be on the console, and yeah, I mean they've been working on HDR rendering for over 10 years. I remember Half-Life 2 made a big deal out of it, and so it's going to happen, and it's going to happen on the console first. I just don't know which one it is. It's probably not going to be Nintendo, though.
All right. Berniak is asking, he is saying to me that I have spoken that I would rather have HDR and P3 in high definition, not ultra high definition or 4K, rather than just having more pixels, which is true.
So at NAB,
I was just going to ask, what's your feeling about that?
So I think, I believe on UHD Blu-ray, I expect more HD HDR content than UHD content. Because you can pretty much go back to existing content and convert it into an HDR version because the dynamic range is already there, but you can't add more resolution.
Do you think it's it's there in the archived version of movies and so on that they have mastered for Blu-ray at standard dynamic range? Do they have elements that go back to the high dynamic range? Because according to Joe Kane, at least up till a certain point, all that we have is the final master of some of these movies. We don't have anything that we can go back to and remaster in high dynamic range. They're going back now and remastering a lot of existing titles into high dynamic range, so I would say yes. Good. Glad to hear it. And that's interesting that you say that the Ultra HD Blu-ray spec, which is essentially done now, and we should see by the end of the year, some product, hopefully, that more titles will actually come out in high definition, 1080p, but with high dynamic range. And perhaps a wider color gamut? What do you think about that?
Definitely a wider color gamut. It's all part of the spec. So I don't think resolution by itself, color gamut by itself, or bit depth by itself really sell a new format. But when you combine them all together, then you actually have something really special. And it's actually compelling at this point.
Yeah, yeah.
Although I think the initial launch titles for UHD Blu-ray will be UHD. Because obviously you can't launch your UHD format with HD titles.
Yeah, I would think not. I would think they'd have to do that. But the question then is, will those initial launch titles be high dynamic range as well, or will they just be more pixels?
I don't know. They haven't announced any launch titles yet, and
no,
it's going to be really tight getting anything out this year. There might be one player and maybe a few titles.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm expecting as well. Well, who was it? Berniak also brought up the color gamut issue, and you guys have mentioned that briefly, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit more, which is not only is there the color gamut, and normally we look at that and we see the CIE diagram, this kind of guitar pick shape thing, but really what we have to deal with in terms of color displays is a color volume. And I have a picture to show that illustrates what a color volume is. It's a two-dimensional representation. But look, we're in a three-dimensional world here, and as things it starts out black, and as it gets brighter and brighter, it widens out. You see more and more colors. And then finally, as it gets to pure white, the colors kind of disappear again. And Stacey, I think you made the point earlier that with high dynamic range, you can still see the yellow gloves of the welder, whereas in standard dynamic range, that yellow becomes white because it's back up at the peak at the little top part where the pure white is. So this is another big advantage of HDR, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, as Joel was pointing out, that his belief is that's going to be the more compelling story for HDR is the visual perception for the saturated colors versus just the pure overall brightness of what it's capable of.
And wide gamut, just like HDR, doesn't mean everything's going to be more colorful. At Cinegear, which happened, I think, in June at Paramount Studios, Sony had a side-by-side demo with their new BVM monitor showing SDR and HDR. And in one scene, it had a woman, and she looked identical in both, but you had 709 gamut and P3 gamut. But in other scenes, then you could actually see where the wider gamut came into play. So wider gamut doesn't mean everything is going to be more saturated. It means you have the capability of being more saturated.
Yeah, exactly. Again, you have a bigger bucket, and palette, and if you put something in that's still inside the boundaries of both of those palettes, 709 or P3, then it's going to be the same. It's going to look the same in both cases. But the important thing is that as it gets brighter, it's not going to shrink down into white as quickly, and you're going to be able to see brighter colors at a higher luminance level without having them wash out.
Yeah, and if we're just going to like throw some numeric numbers out on how that kind of works, you know, basically white is red plus blue plus green, and but blue is only about 8 nits, and red's about 27 nits, and then that leaves 72, I think, or 75, I forget exactly. This is 69. Anyway, green is around that 70 number. And so, you know, what HDR is going to do is it's going to say, oh, well, you want to show red that's 55 nits. Before, you would have to add a little bit of blue and green in and desaturate that red and make it less saturated. Now you're going to be able to maintain that saturation and go brighter. And the other thing is that just by being brighter, it's also going to appear more saturated. And so if you wanted to produce, you know, a really saturated, you know, 50 nit red, which is, you know, not going to burn your retinas out, now with HDR, that's something that we can do.
Yes, exactly. Coulda Woulda in the chat room is asking, is there any commercially available hardware to create HDR content today? Can you simply output from DaVinci Resolve through an NVIDIA GPU to a projector or consumer TV? I mean, yes, seems to me there is. We've already got HDR content out there, right?
Well, at NAB, in the Dolby booth, they showed Resolve and Baselight, both supporting Dolby Vision. I don't know if it's available to current Resolve customers yet. If you're, depending on who you are, you can certainly get access to the tools. So if you're a major Hollywood studio and you want to do HDR, you can get the tools. That's not a problem. But if you're a small independent person, that's much more difficult today.
Yeah, yeah.
But over the coming months, that'll change quickly.
Yeah, as with anything technological and digital anyway, prices fall as you stamp out more chips or write more software.
Right. Well, in this case, I think it's mainly getting the tools ready and stable enough for mass release, as opposed to a few specialty houses that they have to actually support.
Lawn Dog is that... I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, in the case of Dolby, if you want to do Dolby Vision, you actually have to have a Pulsar display, and they've provided all of those to the big customers. So if you want to do Dolby Vision and you don't have a Dolby Vision display, you can't do Dolby Vision content today. But for HDR10, again, you can have a special Samsung, and you can do HDR10 on that.
Right. Lawn Dog is asking, how is Hollywood reacting to having to buy HDR cameras? Seems to me they already have them.
Absolutely. All the existing Arri Alexa and the Red Dragon can shoot HDR today. Film cameras already capture HDR dynamic range.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Oh, Berniak, yeah, was mentioning about that diagram I just showed. Okay, you were mentioning Dolby Vision, and I wanted to talk about this for a while because this is very important. There are several. There isn't only one HDR quote unquote standard. There are several. There's HDR10, which is basically the SMPTE standard using PQ gamma and static metadata, as we were talking about before the show. And then there's Dolby Vision, which is its own thing. And there are a couple others, too. There's one from Technicolor. There's one from Philips. Can these different types of or encoding schemes or whatever you want to call them for HDR, can they coexist? Or will one have to emerge as the standard finally that everybody then conforms to?
So are you saying you don't think an HDR format war is a good thing?
No, I don't. But I think it's maybe inevitable unless, and as I've said many times, unless you can get a display, a TV, a flat panel with HDR capabilities that has the decoders in it of several different formats, just like we now have AVRs with several different audio decoders in them, and whatever comes in, the AVR can decode it. DTS, Dolby Digital, Dolby Atmos, DTS:X, so on and so forth. Are we going to see TVs with multiple HDR decoders in them, or is there going to be another format war?
Well, I was going to say the beauty of Dolby Vision is you can extract HDR10 from it, but then
yeah, well, and what I was going to say is just that I think that, you know, whenever you see the start of any kind of new innovative technology that is worth playing in, you always get a format war. I mean, that's just sort of the natural consequence of everyone wanting to get in on something that's worth having. And so there's going to be a little bit of a format war. Whenever there's a little bit of format war, there's a little bit of blood. But I think what we'll end up seeing is one or two standards, and probably just like with audio, there'll probably be two standards, or, you know, maybe there'll be one or maybe it'll be two, but that there'll be broad support for both of those major standards. I mean,
but they won't be in first generation displays.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, if you want to buy something that's you're going to buy once and keep for 8 years, then you probably don't want to buy the first generation one. If you're going to, you know, if you like being an early adopter and switching hats every 3 years, then, you know, you're going to want to get the first thing you can get.
Mm-hmm. This is always my recommendation as well. You know, if you're an early adopter and you swap out TVs every couple of years anyway, sure, go for it. Get it now. But if you're a longer term investor, so to speak, you might want to wait a year or two before the dust settles.
Yeah.
Let's see. Coulda Woulda is asking, how is HDR any different from the loudness wars in the audio industry, where all that happens is offensively high luminance levels beyond common sense at a loss of dynamic range? This is a very interesting question, and I've never considered it before. The loudness wars mean that the audio, the dynamic range of the audio is compressed to within an inch of its life. And here what we're talking about video-wise is widening it out. Do you think we'll get into a loudness war where how bright can it get and how much into the bright range will it stay?
Well, I think we'll have display manufacturers will have a nits war. You know, mine's 1,000 nits, oh, mine's 2,000 nits, mine's 4,000, mine's 6,000, but that's not compressing the dynamic range.
No.
Yeah, I certainly see them, you know, having a wall of making it look brighter at Best Buy. But I think the difference is that, you know, oh, it sounds louder, so that must be better, isn't really translate to video, where, you know, when you really compress the dynamic range and you lose contrast, then the image looks poorer. And so I think a really bright but really washed out image isn't going to sell, and it's really going to be all about what stands out on the wall at Best Buy. But, you know, like Stacey says, I think a nits war between TV manufacturers is certainly coming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. F-Loop is asking, seems like displays have crummy scalers. Is HDR more prone to getting messed up by scaling? Pixel scaling. I can't see how it would myself.
I don't think so.
Yeah, because it's more about the gamma and tone remapping versus the pure pixel count.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, it's no more or less susceptible than going from standard definition to high definition to ultra high definition. So that's where you really are concerned about your scalars.
Yeah, exactly. Truffle Shuffle says, I can say as a person who has invested in many cameras, highlight handling is crucial to the feel of the image. And I think that's what you guys were saying earlier about specular highlights, and it's not going to just be blinding white, but we're going to have the ability to see more realistic and greater detail in small regions where the highlights can shine through without blowing things out.
Right, and on the digital sensor, if you go back to Red's previous generation, the MX, it would hard clip, and it wasn't a pleasing result. Whereas with the current Dragon sensor and the Area Alexa, it's more of a roll off at the top end, so it goes to it blows out more gracefully, more like film. And that's much more pleasing.
Do you guys have much experience with VR headsets? Because Drew Nielsen is asking, will people buy HDR sets, or will they just buy VR headsets such as Oculus and watch movies on those?
Well,
we'll let Joel take this one.
Yeah, I had a DK2 just to play with it, and maybe in the future. I mean, the thing with an Oculus is that, you know, their current Dev Kit 2 that you can get your hands on is, you know, a 1920 by 1080 display divided up per eye, which, you know, starts to sound like, hey, that might be enough pixels. But then what happens is that, you know, well, that's per eye, so you're really only looking at like 900 pixels across. And when you think about, you know, well, the VR headset pretty much fills up your field of view, but how much field of view does your display actually fill up? Well, maybe it's really only about the center third of it. So then, you know, of those, you know, 900 pixels, okay, so the virtual display you're looking at is about 400 pixels across. So we're not there yet, but when we've got, 4K per eye, 8K per eye kind of VR headsets, then you might want to watch it on your VR headset as opposed to your, forking over the dough for a 80-inch display. But, that's 5-10 years away, I think.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. Not only that, but, if you're in a VR headset, there's the whole issue of how do you make a movie for VR, right? Where you can look anywhere around you, like in a game. And
one of the things they do, they've got cool little cinema viewer apps where it basically puts you in a theater with, a 40-foot screen in front of you. So you have the experience that you're sitting in the theater watching just a regular movie on a regular 16:9 display. And then they can even do the 3D effect, and you can get that, and it's all really pretty engaging. It's just not enough pixels for me yet.
Yeah. I recently saw an Oculus Rift, and it wasn't enough pixels for me either. It was clearly just low res.
I'm not sure I could sit through a 90-minute movie with a headset on, but I think 5-minute clips that you shoot specialty programs, because these camera rigs have 14, 16, 18 cameras on them. Some with stereo pairs, some with mono cameras, and they interpolate stereo. And
yeah, well, and then there's the whole VR video thing, which is an entirely different, where you actually do get 360 video, which is very different from just watching it on the virtual display, because then you get,
well, that's what I meant.
Arbitrary
you
large.
have like 16 red cameras on a 360-degree rig.
Kind of in a big ball looking at all different directions at once.
It's difficult to light a movie when you have cameras pointing in every direction. It's hard to hide the light.
Yeah, right. Where's the cameraman? Where's the crew going to be? Right, exactly.
Yeah, they're under the camera. I think 3D rendered makes much more sense with VR. I think it looks it's a lot easier to do, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. And I also agree with you, Stacey. I'm not sure I'd want to sit through a whole movie with a VR gear thing on my head. I mean, that's, that wouldn't be for me.
Do you remember Circle Vision at Disneyland?
Yeah, sure.
See, I could see something like that where you have a program like that, maybe 5 or 10 minutes long, 15 minutes.
Yeah, I could see that too. Well, one thing I wanted to touch upon here before we end, and we got some minutes left, and we're also going to talk about calibration. But before we get there, I just wanted to talk about the difference between PQ, which is this electro-optical transfer function, and gamma, which we have been using for a long time now, is that gamma is not tied to any particular luminance value, while PQ is. I only learned this recently, and I find it fascinating that the highest value of luminance is tied to or associated with 10,000 nits. And as we said earlier, no display can do 10,000 nits. So what happens when you only go to 1,000 nits? Things get truncated in a way. And there we have one. I have a graphic here called PQ curve limits, which I got from Joe Kane, to show what happens along the PQ curve if you master to 1,000 nits or to 2,000 nits or something like that. Here it is.
I know that app.
You know that one?
Yeah, that's our app that he did that in.
Oh, well, there you go. You can explain it to us then.
Yeah, I mean, so this is just showing us, you know, from 0 to 100% of the signal, how it goes up in luminance, and you know, so I can't quite see where it looks like we've got one line that's probably.
If you could zoom out a little bit, John, just so that we see where there we go. A little bit. A little bit from there.
There we go.
Yeah, so.
There you go.
Right there.
Perfect. Yeah, that must be 1,000, and then the second one must be about 250 based on what I'm looking at there. And so, you know, the idea is that, you know, as the luminance signal increases, and if that's the case, then you can also see right about at 50% is right about where it crosses the threshold for 100 nits. And so, you know, with the way PQ works, they've taken about half of the signal space and allocated it to the standard dynamic range that we're currently using. So even in 10-bit HDR, you're still getting like the effective of 9 bits SDR content in there. And then they've taken that last, you know, then the second half of the signal and allocated it for HDR dynamic range. And, you know, but the idea here too is that, you know, these are, you know, constant values. And so, you know, that 10 at the top could be 10,000, 1,000, 100, you know, 10. And so that each bit level corresponds to a precise luminance, and it's not relative to the measured value that we use with current, you know, BT 1886 or the older when we just use power. And, you know, the reasoning for that is because, you know, they were trying to get the steps tuned to just the right size, you know, so that we were trying to get them below perceptual threshold. And so, you know, if we're sliding the curve up and down based on the peak output of the display, then those contrast ratios are constantly sliding, and we wouldn't have, you know, a fixed value to work off of. And so, you know, now we're going to have different approaches on how we handle that with, you know, a display that can produce 500, 800, 1,000. You know, Dolby's got some special algorithms that they use for remapping down. And, you know, the real question is going to be, you know, how do the different, I think that this is going to be one of the real differentiators between the competing HDR formats is how they handle mapping down, you know, impressively large mastering displays down onto the consumer grade displays. And I think that, you know, how that works, you know, in actual practice is going to be one of the real things to look at to figure out which standard's going to be the correct one to choose.
You make a great point there, because up till now, mastering houses have mastered to 100 nits peak brightness, and those of us who calibrate our TVs have calibrated them to 100 nits peak brightness. And what you're saying now is that the mastering houses may, in fact, use a different peak brightness than what will happen at home?
Well, right. I mean, as Stacey mentioned, Dolby Vision, their reference grade display does 4,000 nits, and we're not seeing any consumer stuff, you know, close to that for the first year, probably not for the second year. And so they're going to have to map it down. And, you know, like who was mentioning with the Samsung displays that are being used by other people mastering content, they've been upgraded with, you know, high end, and then they're only mastering it for 1,000 nits. And so, well, what if you get a 2,000 nit display and you're looking at 1,000 nit content? Well, then it's gonna look a little flatter than having content that was graded up for a higher nit display. And so you're also going to have content that's graded at 1,000 nits, content that's graded at 4,000 nits. And so there's going to be a differentiator with the content as well.
Mm.
Right, because you wouldn't want to stretch that 1,000 nits up to 2,000 nits.
No, you'd want it just to display to 1,000, and that was all that it was made with, and that's all you're going to get to see out of it.
But that doesn't mean manufacturers won't do that.
They'll try to expand it. They'll have their dynamic modes.
Vivid mode. Yeah.
Right. Vivid mode will not go away.
It's HDR squared.
Yeah.
Oh, somebody's going to grab that. You better patent it or copyright it, trademark it right away. Well, let's talk about calibrating high dynamic range displays, because obviously that's what SpectraCal, that's your business, is calibrating displays. And most of us who review TVs and professional calibrators use CalMan, the software that you have developed and are continuing to develop. So my question for you is, does the software currently now allow calibrators and reviewers to calibrate high dynamic range displays? Depends in part on the instrumentation, on what instrument you're using to measure things with, but I'm sure you guys must have been thinking about this for a while. How do we calibrate high dynamic range display, both in terms of the brightness dynamic range and the color?
All right, I'll take it. So yeah, we've got the beginnings of that already in CalMan in the current version that we're shipping. There's the SMPTE 2084 standard for PQ, so that you can select PQ as your EOTF to validate against, and then we can correctly calculate all of the target luminance levels based off of the signals. And you can use that with any pattern generator and compare a display sending, just your basic signal against how it should be performing with PQ, which if you can force a display into a PQ mode, or if you can create a shaper LUT to be able to put it into a PQ EOTF, you can then, validate that the display is behaving properly with that. We're also working to start working with some of the metadata to be able to emulate exactly how a display behaves when you're actually sending in a real HDR signal as well. And so along those lines, we're able to, working with some prototype stuff internally so that we can talk about, right? Yes. Yeah. Sorry, it's one of these things we're under NDA and I can never remember exactly what I can talk about and what I can't talk about. So
okay, well, you got to get clearance from Derek there, I know.
Yeah.
So in an upcoming version, we're going to enable start adding the Dolby metadata, and right now it's only going to work with the internal pattern generator, but we're going to be able to encode it so that it will flip a Dolby Vision display into Dolby Vision mode. And that will, help enable reviewers to start validating that, the display does indeed do what Dolby says that it does, and that it's able to accurately reproduce colors in its Dolby Vision mode as they should be, based on the mastering metadata. Because when I had mentioned that, remapping sauce to take the, 4,000 nit mastered content and DCI, the Dolby Pulsar also does, DCI gamut, and I don't believe the first consumer displays are going to be quite as large of a gamut, and so Dolby Vision accommodates whatever gamut the target display can do, and so we're going to be able to take the golden standard and validate that the display is producing the golden standard for that model, and that it's accurate. And then in terms of hardware, the meters that are out there now, most of the colorimeters go to about 1,000 nits. So for the first generation of consumer HDR displays, we should have hardware in the field that should be able to measure that relatively accurately. The spectroradiometers, of course, aren't ever really going to be able to do that kind of dynamic range. And then the high-end tools that the professional have, like a Klein K10 or a colorimeter or your research colorimeter, either of those, exceed 5,000 nits, and so we shouldn't have a problem for a long time with the real professional gear.
But the colorimeters, of course, are tri-stimulus and require offsets and profiles and stuff. I didn't know that spectroradiometers can't get that, are not sensitive, can't sense that bright an image.
Well, just similar to how we were talking about, what a camera's capable of. Their sensors are, you can do it with things like neutral density filters to put in front of them to take them back down if you've got equipment that's like that. But for the most part, if you do that, then you're not going to be able to measure the low end. So, if you have a spectroradiometer and a colorimeter, typically what you would do is, profile it so that you can, detect the differences between what your filters see in the colorimeter and what the actual backlight is, because, that difference is really the important bit. And then once you're able to create a meter profile, then you would just use the colorimeter because, basically the dynamic range of a spectroradiometer is never going to be able to capture the lows and the highs of an HDR monitor at the same time. And so you can measure, the total brightness using a neutral density filter, and you can measure the darkest bits without it. But really, the colorimeter is going to be the right tool for the job. But you would want to profile it off of the spectroradiometer to get the accuracy back.
Right. We have a couple of screenshots from Calman, the high dynamic range portion of it. Let's take a look at those.
Sure.
The first one is, I think, just the buttons, right, that let you pick different aspects that you want to look at.
Yeah, and it's got our little welcome blurb to, let you know that we're now able to use the PQ EOTF, and that's how the workflow is set up, and let you know the different types of measurements that you're going to be able to do in the application.
So there's a lovely little welcome message, and then to the right we see the buttons for the different types of activities that you can do. And then the second one is, I think, the grayscale screen. Tell us just a bit about this.
Right, and so over here, this, for the most part, looks like the standard grayscale from our quick analysis workflow in Calman. But the really big difference is that we've converted the, what we used to show with a gamma chart over to a luminance chart. And so it shows the luminance reproduction of the display against the PQ curve against the signal there at the bottom. And so, those are bit levels there on the x-axis going from 16 to 255. And then on the y-axis, then those are the actual nit values going from 0 to 1200. And so you can kind of then get, very similar to, Joe's graph that was the same data but presented as logarithmic on the y-axis. This one is using a linear axis. And so you can kind of see how, like the first half of the signal, like I was mentioning before, goes, up to about 100 nits. And then, the second half is what takes us from, SDR into HDR land. And that, really even 1,000 nits is still, about 70% of the signal. So the next 900 nits is, about 25%. And then like the last 25% of the signal is, from 1,000 to 10,000.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned
which tells you a lot about how our eye works, in that the brighter it gets, the larger the steps need to be able to perceive a difference.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned one last thing. You mentioned 16 to 255, which is an 8-bit dynamic range. But of course, we're going to at least 10 now, where you can go. I believe the black level is defined as 64 and the white level at 1019. So you've got a lot more numbers there, 4 times as many, in fact. But yeah, and yet your display there still is in 8-bit mode. Are you going to go to a 10-bit mode display there at some point?
Well, those are just all labels, and we probably will make a update that shows you how to be able to modify the labeling of them.
Yeah. In fact, we had this conversation yesterday.
Very timely.
At a request of one of the customers that's using this exact workflow for their customers.
So
in the professional space, we want the labels in 10-bit. We're like, okay.
Well, it's worth pointing out, though, PQ is 0 to 1.
Right.
And that graph should only go to 235, not 255.
That graph really should. So, and that's,
which is 940 in 10-bit, not the 1019. So PQ is from 64 to 940 in 10-bit.
Right,
Yep.
to 940. But there is some headroom, according to Joe. Again, I've spoken with him.
I've never heard that.
Well, to give you an idea, that 1019 would be 22,000 or 24,000 nits.
I think it was 22.
Yeah. So the 10,000 nits goes to the 940. To go to 255, I think it's 22 or 24,000 nits.
Oh, I see. Interesting. Okay, so 940 is 10,000 nits.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, okay.
Which,
all right.
which
well,
when you 940 divided by 4 goes right back down to 235. So.
Right. So we have 4 times the number of steps between min and max, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, we come to the end of a fabulous hour. I want to thank you, all 3 of you, for being here and talking to us in some depth about high dynamic range. Joel Barsotti, Director of Software Development, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Scott.
Glad to have you here. Derek Smith, CTO and co-founder, thank you.
Oh, Scott, it's always a joy.
Thank you. And Stacey Spears, Chief Color Scientist at SpectraCal. All of you guys at SpectraCal. Stacey, thanks again.
And thank you, Scott. Until next time.
Until next time, indeed. You can find out all about what SpectraCal is doing at their website, spectracal.com. You can reach me online at avsforum.com, and you can email me at scott@twit.tv. And you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott and at avsforum. And you can always find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here at twit.tv/htg and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twithometheatergeeks. Next week, I have at least 2 guests scheduled. It's going to be David Meyer, the CEO of Chords, K-O-R-D-Z, cable manufacturing company, and Kevin Taylor, a consultant to THX, and they're going to be talking about the new THX certification program for 4K HDMI cables. So that should be very interesting, and I do hope you will join me. Until then, geek out.